Now, when we think about the Civil War, I decided to go ahead and do like a quick Google search of what the Civil War means. And on Google Images, I searched, and this is what came up when I searched Civil War. Now, obviously, as you can tell, this is not what I had intended to actually research about the Civil War. But obviously this whole term of like the Civil War, what is it, and things like that have come up extensively, and especially with current events in the last couple of years. Now, in terms of the Civil War, we're going to see if you guys remember something from your assignment that you did. So try to think back to your March Madness. The Civil War is going to have a big impact from a thing called Fort Sumter. What happened at Fort Sumter?
First battle.
The first battle and the first shots of the war. If you got that, good job. You have adequately learned for your March Madness assignment. If you said, I've never heard of Fort Sumter, please go back and do your assignment that you probably did not complete. Okay? So, with Fort Sumter becomes the very first shots of the war. So remember, you probably learned that basically all these Confederates went to this armory here in Fort Sumter. With this, South Carolina has already seceded. All these other states secede as well. The North sends a bunch of troops to Fort Sumter. The border states are going to secede, and it then begins the Civil War. Now, when we talk about the Civil War, though, you have to remember that the Civil War did not necessarily have, at the beginning, this idea of this big, giant war that was going to kill almost a third of the adult male population in the United States. Really, people thought it was no big deal. Now, with the Battle of Bull Run, which you also should have learned about, correct? First major battle of the war. Anybody research what it was also called? Manassas, yeah. It's also called the First Battle of Manassas because there's this creek called Manassas Creek. Now, at the Battle of Bull Run, though, people actually showed up in these like really nice, pretty dresses and picnics. People thought that you were going to go see this little skirmish, kind of one of those, hey, let's hash it out, let's go out to the flagpole at 3 o'clock, we'll push each other around, and then we'll be all good and we'll go home. People went to this battle and surrounded the entire battlefield, thinking that it was just going to be some fun little thing that they were going to watch. Nobody was going to be really going to die, probably. Maybe a few, and then we'd all go home and be a union again. So people showed up really thinking that this was going to be just some Sunday afternoon where you could be able to watch this cute little battle take place. Now, we have heard of this guy named Johnny Horton before. Anybody remember from where?
Nope.
We listened to a song by him.
You wrote a song called The Battle of New Orleans.
Yes, it's also on here, the Battle of New Orleans. Okay? So, the Battle of New Orleans, as you know, was like about the War of 1812. Johnny Horton does a ton of historical songs when he was around in like the 70s and 60s. And so he wrote this song about the Battle of Bull Run that really gives a great representation of what happens at Bull Run. So we're going to listen to this song. I have the lyrics up on the board. It is very catchy. So sing along if you'd like. But what I want you to do, hey, I haven't seen you in forever. Yeah. Hi, you too. Stephen B.
That's him right here. That's you.
Okay. So, we're going to listen to this song, and what I want you to think when we're listening to this song is, what is he trying to say? What's his message that he's trying to get across? And I just had to pull it up real quick. 1 second. And the lyrics are up on the board if you need to follow along. As soon as it begins to play the song. There it is. Okay.
The sun shone bright and clear that day. All left Washington to lift the rebel boys in glee at the Battle of Bull Run. They came from Pennsylvania, some from Maryland, to see the rebel boys get spanked. A honest, it's broad hand.
message Johnny Horton is trying to say happened at the Battle of Bull Run? Yes.
They thought that they were going to totally destroy the rebels, but they actually got destroyed themselves.
Yeah, so when they say this phrase, don't count your chicks before they're hatched, right? They're trying to say, don't get cocky and go in there and say that you're going to win this battle. Really, the Union thought that they were going to walk in, the rebels were all going to run in fear, and that it would all be over. Is that what actually happened? No. It talks about how Manassas Creek ran the blood red, right? It was complete hell because of the fact that this thing was a massive disaster. Yes, I just swore. Sorry. I apologize. Okay? Now, when they go to talk about this, I'm sorry, guys. Okay. So, when we get into, going into kind of the impacts of this, okay, you have to realize that people really started to realize this was going to be a bloody, awful war. So on your notes, we're going to be starting on the chart. What I've done is I've taken the 4 key concepts. So those bolded are the exact word-for-word phrases of the key concepts. And on those key concepts, your goal is how can you be able to answer those key concepts with the information. So below each key concept, I put how I would possibly answer that in order to be able to kind of show it. But you never know what they could ask on the AP exam. So what we're going to start with is we're going to start with the differences between the North, the Southern, and the border states. So we're going to start with the demographics of the North. And really, if you want to write at the top of this chart that you want to know the differences between these. So you need to know the differences between the North, the border states, and the South. So on demographics of the North, if you will highlight fought to preserve the Union. Now, we've learned about this in the past when we read Abraham Lincoln. If you guys remember, we read that speech that says, a house divided cannot stand. That's what we're talking about. Abraham Lincoln's big thing was about preserving the Union, not necessarily to stop slavery. Now, if you will also star the second bullet and highlight population and industry. Part of the reason why the North was so successful was because of the fact that they had the majority of the population. Why this would be important? Anybody have any guesses of what state, based on what you know about population of the East Coast, what state had the most amount of death in the Civil War? New York. That's right. Okay. Pennsylvania was third. Pennsylvania was third. Now, what happens is that because New York and things like that, they're losing so many people, but because they have such a high population, all they have to do is replace that population with these new people. So it works out really well. Now, the industry is very important because in the South, they rely on one single industry, and what's that? Cotton, right? Now, when the war begins, and we start that Anaconda Plan, as you've learned about, stopping the trade between Europe and the South, is that when they go to be able to stop that trade, can cotton be transported to other places now? No. So the Southern economy collapses, whilst in the North, those textile mills and things like that are able to continue to keep running. Now, in terms of economics, if you will put next to economics, successful. Now, compared to the South, the economics of the North become very successful. In particular, they were able to create a money system that was able to withstand the war. So if you've ever heard of the IRS is what collects your taxes. They're now able to collect taxes and be able to fund the war. The creation of greenbacks is the creation of a central money system so that they can still create an economy. And then if you will highlight the draft, in order to be able to force people to go into the war, they're going to institute a draft. And if you'll make sure you're not reading Lord of the Flies for me, that would be great. So with the draft, though, you are now able to be able to get people to come into the war without you having to volunteer yourself. Why this is beneficial to you is that they're able to get tons of army men to come into this battle without any retribution or without any fear of not getting enough people. However, there's one thing that happens with the draft. Does anybody know what was different about the draft in the Civil War?
Suck.
Well, I guess. I mean, you had to fight in it. The Civil War actually had the ability that you could pay to get out of the draft. If you found somebody that could take your place, all you had to do is be like, hey, here's $500, go fight in the war for me. and they would go fight in the war for you, and you could avoid the draft. So a lot of our famous people during this time, which we'll learn about when we get to the next period, is that a lot of our famous people avoid the Civil War and avoid death because they're able to pay somebody else to fight for them and die for them. So a little bit different. Can you still do that now? No, obviously can't do that now. Although a draft is very, very unlikely. Could happen, but we'd have to destroy our entire military. Yeah.
Do the other people fight under the other person's name, or do they just fight in their place?
They fight in their place, but how it works is basically in their draft papers, it says their name, and then it says fighting for, and then the person that they are fighting for. Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of those people did die. So a lot of our people, like if you've heard the Vanderbilts, the person that the Vanderbilts paid died in the war. We'll learn about the Vanderbilts next period, but next period 6. But yeah, unfortunately, they did cause a lot of them to die. But you got your family out of poverty, so that's kind of a good thing. Now on the next side, we also have the people who are against the war. In theory, you should have heard this name before. Now, these are the Copperheads. Now, if you will highlight that these are part of the Democratic Party. Now, remember, Democrats are going to be more southern. So these are Democrats living in the north that say that they want, and if you will highlight, immediate peace. The goal is to be able to stop the war immediately and move on. Now, in terms of like the imagery of this, a copperhead is actually a type of snake. And so when they talk about the copperheads, this is a really common political cartoon that you might end up seeing, is that you can see that the copperheads, which are these northern Democrats, are trying to kill off the Union, who's right here, who's just trying to preserve liberty and keep the Union together. So if you ever see this, this is probably the most common representation of copperheads that you might see on the AP exam. Now, heading into the South. Now, in the South, if you will highlight states' rights, and above states' rights, I want you to write this. If you will write down the Anti-Federalists, / the Democratic Republicans, / the Democrats. And the reason why is because those three parties have been around since 1790. All of them are that southern cause of states' rights. States should have more power than the federal government. Think the same thing with the national bank crisis. Nullification. All of those are states' rights driven by the Democrats. Now, the other issue that's going to come up is slavery. If you will highlight slavery. Now, a lot of this is over the idea that the federal government does not have the power to end slavery, does not have the power to take away this property. An interesting fact about this issue of states' rights versus slavery. If you go to school in the South, they teach the Civil War a lot differently than we teach the Civil War. In fact, up until last week, so this is a current event as of last week, they actually had it so that you could not say that slavery was a major cause of the Civil War. It was not in their curriculum. You were not supposed to teach that slavery was a major cause. You could only teach that it was states' rights. States' rights were the cause and why the South went to the Civil War. Now, as of last week, the Texas legislature changed this, so for the first time in their curriculum, they are now allowed to teach that slavery was a major cause and factor of the Civil War. So we still have a little bit of heated debate. A lot of the deep southern states or deep southern cities will not teach that slavery is one of the major rules. But a lot of it has to do with the fact of what does the federal government have? Can they take away your slaves? Can they not? What is the power of this property? Now, next to one more thing really quick before we move on. If you will also highlight strong military tradition, it's part of the reason they have such good generals like Robert E. Lee. They're used to having a good military tradition and fighting in the wars. And then if you will put next to economics, failure. Now, compared to the North, the South is unable to economically be successful. Part of this is because of this first one. If you will star this first bullet, that's part of the major reasons why. Because you're not able to raise taxes or tariffs in the South, it's very difficult to be able to raise money to form a government and form an army. While in the North, you have the draft. In the South, you actually had to volunteer to join the army. It's part of the reason why they were starting to run out of people.
Wait, is the reason they couldn't do taxes is because they thought the government shouldn't have the power?
Yes, exactly. They didn't want their Confederate government to become just like the Union government. And so they said no taxes, no tariffs, very Articles of Confederation-y, very much states' rights, no federal power of a central government. And so they had no power to pay or to raise taxes. And if you don't know, you need taxes to run a government and to be able to run an army. It's part of the reason why the army ran out of food. A lot of the people in the army had to start bringing in and buying their own food because the Confederate army ran out. So they didn't have the money to pay for it. All right. Other things that happened. The only way they could raise money is to have what's called a cash bond. Basically, that's where you loan your money to the government. The government uses it, and then after the war, they give it back plus interest. It's kind of like a loan. But the problem is that in this war, 90% of the wealth is lost. And when all that wealth is gone, you can't fund the government. Bread riots, if you ever see this term, what it's referring to is that the women were so fed up with not being able to eat and feed their families that they began to actually riot and began to storm stores and actually steal bread. And it's called the bread riots in the South. So just kind of making you aware of that. With the border states, the thing that you need to know about the border states is you need to know that the border states were the ones that were most at threat to secede from the Union. These were the ones that had slaves, didn't have slaves, they had the most battles fought in it. Was one of his biggest concerns. Mostly I'm just trying to get you aware of the term border states in case you see it on the exam. Now, we're going to go over the strategies of the war in the South. A lot of this you guys already know, so we're going to skip these two and head right down to Britain's role in the war because we're going to talk about specific war strategies in just a minute, okay? We're almost done with the extensive notes, and then we get to the fun videos of war. So, we're getting there. Now, Britain's role in the war, if you will put next to this, foreign policy. Foreign policy. Now, this is going to be how Britain is going to react to this war. Now, remember, Britain is very dependent on southern cotton. However, a lot of the people in Britain no longer want to support that southern cause. Part of the reason is because they felt like the cotton they were using was being sponsored through awful techniques of slavery and things like that. Have you guys ever heard of the term what's called a blood diamond? Has anybody ever heard of that term? Okay, what a blood diamond is, and those were really popular in the 90s and the 2000s, is that what happened is that all these famous people were getting these big, giant, expensive diamonds, but then when they actually looked into where those diamonds came from, they found out that in Africa, those diamonds were being collected through murder, through violence, and all these different things, and so blood diamonds nowadays are illegal. In Britain, they felt like this cotton was just representing slavery and the awful treatment of these slaves. So what you need to know with Britain in the war is you need to know the second bullets for why they did not recognize the Confederacy. Number 1 is Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we've talked about in the past. And then number 2 is if they were to fight against the Union, which is more than likely what would happen, if the Union won, they'd lose Canada, and they didn't want to lose Canada. But Britain refuses to fight in the war. All right, so let's move on to some big name terms that you will need to know. Go ahead and flip it over. So these are some big name things that you need to be able to know for the AP exam. And we're going to start with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I want to introduce you to a slave named Gordon. Okay? Now, at this time, you have the Fugitive Slave Law. However, with the Fugitive Slave Law, if the South doesn't exist anymore, is there a need for a Fugitive Slave Law? No. Right? Well, what happens is a couple weeks after Fort Sumter, there's this guy, he's chilling in a fort, he's a general. A bunch of runaway slaves come up to his fort and say, we want to fight for the Union. He's like, all right, I guess we haven't been told, but sure, come on in. They go into the fort, they stay there a couple days, and then some slave catchers from the South come. They said, per the Fugitive Slave Law, we would like to take our slaves back to the South. Well, his general is sitting there and he's thinking, and he responds to them in layman's terms and basically says, well, if the South doesn't exist, neither does the law exist anymore either. By saying that, he begins to have tens of thousands of slaves begin to run to the north and flee the South as runaway slaves. Now, in terms of when they come up, a lot of them join the Union Army because it's an easy way to be able to get money and food and also support the Northern cause. When they did this, they would take pictures of them as they entered. So this is like his entrance picture into the Union Army. Has anybody ever been to the African American Smithsonian Museum in D.C.? Okay, a couple of people. You actually might have heard of Gordon. It's one of the most famous artifacts in the entire museum. If you missed it, it's because his picture was this small. It was the original picture of Gordon as the slave. So you might have seen it. It was really itty-bitty. But basically what happened is they took this picture and they said, we now need to do a medical exam. Well, when they go to do the medical exam, they realize that there's a little bit of a problem. You see, as you know, and this was also right next to it, so maybe you recognize the bigger one. It was right next to this, and it would be small. This is a slave whip. Now, you know with a slave whip, though, it's going to be awful and terrible. This slave whip is about 1.5 inches in thickness, extremely rough and tough leather, and when you whip that person, it was extremely painful, like being hit with barbed wire. So they have Gordon the slave, and they said, all right, we need to do your physical to make sure you're healthy enough to join the Union Army. Well, here is what they find. So they take off his shirt, and this person is about 45 years old is their estimate. So this is 45 years of being whipped and hit with that whip. Now what happens is that this image gets sent by a doctor up north on a postcard. It was like, why would they make a postcard? That was actually very popular because it was the cheapest way to send photographs back and forth. So it was pretty popular to send photographs like this as a postcard. Now what happens is that he writes this, so it says, I have found a large number of the 400 contrabands, which we'll talk about that word in a second, examined by me to be as badly lacerated as the specimen represented in the enclosed photograph. Basically, he's saying that he is going to look at 400 different runaway slaves, and they all have these wounds that Gordon has. Now, this gets sent up to the north, and people start to feel uncomfortable. They're saying, why are we accepting this? Why is this a thing? And massive amounts of anti-slavery, otherwise known as abolition, begins to skyrocket into the north. Now, I want to talk about this word contraband, and in your second bullet for the Emancipation Proclamation, if you will highlight the word contraband, this word is really important. You guys have probably been in AP Euro and AP World. You've had a lot of wars thrown at you. When you're in a war and you conquer something, that is what is known as contraband. It's physical items that you have won. This could be land that you have conquered. This could be if you went and conquered a farmhouse and you collected all these different farm supplies. That is contraband. It's anything that you win in the war. In this case, he is referring to a slave as a contraband, which means that a slave is what? It's a property in a victory of war. So what happens is Lincoln has this idea. If there are all these contrabands that we have taken into the north as runaway slaves or as Union soldiers, and we have all this contraband in the south, if we release this contraband, all these people will now economically destroy the south. So what he's going to issue is what is known as the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation frees all the slaves in the south and frees them as contraband, saying that they are now a free person. Why this is important. If you will start or highlight your second to last bullet and make sure that you highlight a military tactic. Basically, here's what they figure out. By releasing all the slaves are now going to view, and this is an image from a former slave from the South, is that when this comes out, people now see Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. He is the savior of the Southern man and the Southern slave. So, they are going to massively flee to the north. What happens to the South then? Do they have anybody to run their plantations?
No.
Nope. So what happens to the Southern economy? It plummets. If you will put next to this the big effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, it economically destroys Southern cotton industry. Because now their labor force is gone. Estimates are around 80 to 90% of the slaves in the South attempt to or succeed in running up north to become free. If you don't have anybody to run your plantations, are the plantation owners going to do it? No, they're not going to go pick the cotton, right? And the South becomes economically disastrous. That's why when we look at those economic factors from the front page, that's part of the reason it becomes affected. As runaway slaves go to the north, they begin to join the Union Army in massive amounts. There's primary sources that talk about slaves swimming across lakes and rivers in an attempt to be able to get across and join the Union Army in order to become successful. So now let's get to a really fun event, which everybody loves, which is Gettysburg, which most people put as the second most important thing in the Civil War on your guys' assignment. Now, Gettysburg becomes the biggest amount of casualty battles in the Civil War. When we look at this 51,000 number, 51,000 is not dead, it is casualties. About 18,000 died. The rest are going to be wounded or missing during this battle. About 20,000 people were never found from this battle. Now, let's talk about Gettysburg. Gettysburg has a nickname as the battle that started because of a shoe. Basically, what happens is this. Gettysburg did not have any strategic benefit. It was not beneficial in any way to the Confederacy. It was in the North. That was important to them. But it really had no strategic value. On the outskirts of town, you have the Confederates. They hear that apparently a shoe factory or a shoe festival was in Gettysburg. What they decide is if they go into Gettysburg, they can take over the town, they could take those shoes for their army men, move on, and leave. It was supposed to be like a less than half a day thing where you come in, get what you need, and you leave. As they go to approach the town, a small cavalry unit of about 2,000 people notice this Confederate outfit of about 5,000 approaching into town. The leader of that area tells one of his messengers, go tell General Meade, who was the general of the Union Army. He had only been general for 3 days at this time. He tells him to go round up people and bring them back. This general that was there, he put his rifle up onto a fence post, shot at the cavalry, they shoot back, and you now begin the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the first day was actually kind of a mess for the Union. They actually had to pull back. The Confederate Army succeeded in moving forward. General Lee decides we're going to have a battle here, and that's on July 1st of 1863, excuse me. Now, what happens is we also have a ton of heroics come out of this battle. One of these heroics is a guy named Colonel Chamberlain, who is one of my favorite stories and people in American history. Now, what happens is that on the second day, this is what it looks like. Now, if you see, this is like a fish hook. If you've ever heard of the fish hook, that's what you're looking at right here. Now, what happens is that this is the Union Army. These are the Confederates. Now, right here used to be controlled by the Confederate Army. The problem is this guy was sitting on these little round tops, and he was like, wow, this is really boring. We're not seeing any action. Without the other people's knowledge, he moves his people about 5 miles this way and leaves these two round tops completely strategically exposed. Now, the Union Army sends a bunch of itty-bitty small regiments, which is the smallest amount, it's about 100 people, to cover these different things. Lee has a great idea. If he can get around the outside, take over these round tops, he can do what's called flanking the army, which is going around the outside of the army. He can then either come from the back side or the front side and easily win the battle. Well, they put a bunch of people up here, including Colonel Chamberlain's men. And what happens, and what's really famously known as, is the Battle of Little Round Top. Now, here's the problem. These men are sitting at the top of this little round top, defending it. Problem is, they're small, they're not very well trained, and they run out of ammo. So you have about 100 guys at the top of this hill. They have no more ammo, and coming up the hill is about 5,000 Confederate troops with bullets ready to go. So how are they going to win this battle? They know that if they lose Little Round Top, then they will be able to probably lose the war. So let me kind of explain before we watch the clip of what happens. So I'll kind of explain really quickly what he's going to do. So remember, he has no ammo, and he has to be able to win this battle. 1 second. Maybe. Oh, it was up there the whole time. All right, so here's basically what he is going to do. So at the top of this hill, you have this works. On the top of this hill, you have Colonel Chamberlain's men. Okay? About 100 people at the top of the hill. Coming up from the bottom of the hill are approximately 5,000 Confederate troops. So here's what Chamberlain comes up with. He is going to take his men and create a line that goes out like this. Now here's basically what he says. On the count of 1, 2, 3, this is going to swing in like a door and come in from the side. And these guys from the top are going to come in this fight as well. You say, well, that sounds great, but you have no ammo, so what are you going to do? Well, what they're... Yeah. Spoiler alert. But yeah, what they're going to do is they are going to do what's called fixed bayonets, which means that instead of firing with guns, they're going to take those swords, put them at the end of their rifle. They're told to run at the Confederates with full strength with the rifles on the bottom of, or the end of their rifle, and kind of hope for the best. That's the goal. The idea was to scare them into leaving. So we're going to watch what happens to Colonel Chamberlain's troops. Now this clip that we're about to watch is from the movie Gettysburg, which is an awesome movie. Has anybody seen it? Alright, cool, a couple people. If you ever have 4.5 hours of your time that you're like, wow, I really need something to do, you can go and watch Gettysburg because it's 4.5 hours long. And it's a bit tiresome to watch, but it's really good. It's one of the best historical films that they have out there. So we're going to watch this Battle of Gettysburg, and I want you to think, how successful was Colonel Chamberlain in succeeding in this? All right, so let's watch it.
Sir, we ought to pull out.
No, we can't do that.
We can't hold them against Shag. You know that.
Well, if we don't, they go on by and over the hill.
You want me to restart? You good? Okay.
Is this one that's not captured?
Yeah, this is the only one that's not captioned.
Sir, we ought to pull out.
No, we can't do that.
We can't hold them against Shag. You know that.
Well, if we don't, they go on by and over the hill and the whole flank caves in. Sir, here they come. We can't run away. If we stay here, we can't shoot. So let's fix bayonets. We'll have the advantage of moving down the hill. They gotta be tired, the rest. They gotta be close to the end if we are. So fix bayonets. Ellis, wait, Ellis, you take the left wing, I'll take the right. I want a right wheel forward of the whole regiment.
What, you mean charge?
Yes, but here's what we do. We're going to charge swinging down the hill. Just like you pulled back this left side of the regiment, now we're going to swing it down. We swing like a dog. We're going to sweep them down the hill just as they come up. Understand? Does everybody understand?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Ellis, you take the left wing. And when I give the command, I want the whole regiment to go forward, swinging down to the right.
All right, sir. Fine.
Move.
if you notice, they all fixed bayonets, and I know it seems kind of funny when you watch it in the film, but I'm sure it was way scarier if you were actually there. Now, when they go to charge down this hill, and I'm going to not use the primary source language, I'm going to use like hip, cool, your term language of basically what happened. But pretty much when you look at these different primary sources, basically what they say is they started to go up the hill, and then thousands of crazy people were running down the hill with swords, and we all ran away. And that's exactly what happened, is they saw all these people running at them with swords and bayonets, and even though they had guns, they either dropped them and surrendered, or they took off the other way. In fact, a lot of diaries actually said that they estimated that there were over 5,000 Union troops coming down the hill. How many were there actually? Like 100. And so, what is this whole thing? Psychological warfare, right? You come, if you have somebody running at you with a sword and is screaming at you, that's pretty scary and intimidating, and it works. Basically, after the first day, they're able to take these little, so if you take all these little blue thingies, they're able to make it all the way down on a little round top, and on the second day, some people call it a stalemate, whatever it could possibly be. The goal is that they've been able to hold the line. Now, we enter into day 3, and day 3 becomes a really big deal. Lee decides that he is going to do the final straw, the final dagger into the Union Army. He first starts on Culp's Hill at 7 a.m. His goal was to take this over and basically take all the little red things, bring it around the side over here, and attack from the back. Culp's Hill fails, and he is not able to do that. And so he's going to make a decision that probably defines Lee's career. Now, I know some of you had Lee towards the very end, and Lee was an amazing general. He was very, very good. He made one huge mistake, though, that kind of cost him his career, as in people say that this is the big reason why the Union or Confederates are going to lose. You see, here's what he has an idea. He has this one general named Longstreet. He takes all of Longstreet's men, and his goal is to run across into the middle, divide the Union Army in two, into one side and one side, so that you can be able to attack them and crumble them. That was the goal. Now, this would have been very successful, but there's one huge problem with this, because we've done this in the past in World War II. Now, what happens is what is known as Pickett's Charge, which becomes probably one of the worst military disasters in American history. Basically, here's what they're going to do. Just like we said, they're going to run across and they're going to split the army in two. But here's the problem. On one side, it's a Cemetery Ridge, you have the Union Army of about 5,000 to 7,000 men. They are protected by a giant wall, which if you go there today is like knee-high. Back then it was more like neck-high, so you could be protected. Then they have 1 mile, and this is from the actual battlefield itself. If you notice, is there any cover in this field? No. There's these trees, which back then did not exist. Okay? So there are basically no trees whatsoever. And you have 1 mile of this entire stretch that you're going to have 7,000 Confederate soldiers run across. There are 9 fences that they have to jump over. And if you say, well, why didn't they just knock over the fences? These fences are sturdy and put into the ground by about 5 feet. You can't pull them out of the ground. So they have to jump 9 fences plus this, and then they have to be able to attack the Union Army who's over here. So what they start is at 1 p.m., they start artillery fire, which are giant long-range bombs. Now, they start to fire at rapid succession until they're almost completely out of artillery ammo, which is a great idea, right? Bomb them over here and then rampage them with guns. What they didn't know is that the entire field gets filled with smoke, so they can't see. Their artillery fire comes out about 1/4 mile short. So they're sitting here bombing over here on the Union, and all the bombs are hitting right about here. Okay? So the Union Army just waits. That's all they do. They sit there and wait for about an hour. The Confederates are beginning to run out of artillery shells, and they now decide they're going to begin their charge. The Union Army puts all of their cannons right up on the wall. The Confederates begin to jump over each of these fences. As they're jumping over, they're being hit constantly with artillery fire. They were told with the Union Army that you wait until you see the whites of their eyes, which is very similar to like Bunker Hill. They say, do not shoot until you know you're going to hit them. So they wait until these guys are like 75 yards out and then just start shooting them. And they even have people that are handing out their guns constantly and just shoot, shoot, shoot. Now, we're going to watch a clip from Gettysburg of the results of this. Now, here's my warning to you. People explode in this video. Okay, it is a war film. It does end with a rather large explosion. So I'm just warning you now. Okay, so this is your little warning. The video ends with, we end with the biggest explosion in the whole clip. Okay? Now I want you to think as we watch this, what is the perception of the Confederacy in this? Does the Confederates look like they're making a wise choice? Or do the Confederates look like they're making a very wrong choice? Okay, so that's kind of your decision here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. By the way, this is known as Pickett's Charge because Longstreet orders Pickett's men to run first. You'll notice Pickett at the very front. He'll be pretty clear. And I want you to think, how does Pickett look as a general in terms of fighting into this battle? So again, here's your warning. Warning, warning. Most people really like the ending of the explosion, but...
Virginians! Virginians! With me! Who will come with me?
That was a very common military thing. To have the hat on the sword. Okay, there was your person exploding. Now, in terms, what do you mean you missed it? Okay, you can go watch 4.5 hours, and I'm not going to tell you where it's at in the movie. Now, in terms of this, first off, as the general, as Pickett's running, how does Pickett look? He looks stupid in today's world, right? We're like, why would you ever think that that would be a smart idea to run across this giant field? In terms of the Confederate soldiers, does it look like they're going to win this or lose this? Lose it, right? Now, did you guys notice when they got to the wall? What happened to them when they got to the wall?
They died.
They got shot. They got exploded. Okay? Now, when we talk about that, that really is what happened. They basically had this wall so fortified that people approached the wall and got shot immediately with a cannon. Now, in terms of the numbers of people who made it over this wall, out of the 7,000 men who come across, 71 make it over the wall. That's it. Only 71. And out of those 71, only 3 make it alive as prisoners of war. So this was a complete and total disaster. About 30 minutes into this, and if we actually look, there's a story that says that one of the fence posts, they actually took one of the fence posts and counted how many bullet holes in it, and there were over 870 bullet holes in a single fence post. That's how awful this battle was. Now, in terms of what happens next, about 30 minutes into this charge, all these people turn back. Why that's a huge deal is because at this time, and really up until the end of Vietnam, if you deserted and you fled, you could be shot and killed. And so at this line of trees, there are people waiting that if you flee, they're going to shoot you for being a deserter. And yet, almost 5,000 people flee back to the forest. Supposedly the legend goes that Robert E. Lee was sitting on a fence post. He had his head in his hands, and he said, "This is all my fault. All your death is on my hands." Because he really felt like this was a disaster. Following Pickett's charge, he moves everybody south, he moves them back into Virginia, and they don't enter Northern Territory for the rest of the war. In terms of the impact of Gettysburg, massive, massive casualties. This entire city, of this farm city, is just littered with people. Now, they have to be able to bury this dead. How they buried this dead, though, is they were in a rush. And what they had as a rule is that whoever was in charge of the city cemetery would be in charge of burying the bodies. Normally, this is only like maybe 2,000, 3,000. At this battle, it's almost 18,000 dead. The other problem is that the person in charge of the cemetery was male and had been drafted into the military. He left behind a wife who was 7 months pregnant. So what did that 7 months pregnant woman do? She went and dug all of the graves for these soldiers. She hired cemetery workers that were grave diggers to bury these graves. They said the stench was too awful that they couldn't actually get themselves to. She couldn't get the grave diggers to go. So she buried almost 80% of the people who died at Gettysburg herself at 7 months pregnant. Now the thing is, they buried them where they died. So they basically dug big holes. They put them in. As the war continues on, and Gettysburg really wasn't seen as that big of a deal. Gettysburg was just another battle. Vicksburg, which actually happened the day afterwards, people thought that was the... What? What's funny about Vicksburg? Vicksburg was a decisive Union victory. Anyways, so what happens, though, is that it's not that big of a deal. People think Vicksburg is way more important than Gettysburg. Well, what happens is that they decide that they are going to create a national cemetery. There's all this stench, like all these holes are caving in. You have Confederates buried with Union members. People are wanting to bury their dead. And so what they're going to do is they're going to create a national cemetery. Oh, by the way, in terms of statistics, if you want to know the difference between this war and other wars, we currently have the Civil War as the most amount of American dead. And that's over all the different wars. Almost a third of the male population dies during the Civil War. Now, in terms of what they're going to do next, they are going to create a national cemetery at Gettysburg in order to be able to memorialize that dead. They have a big ceremony. The leader of that ceremony speaks for almost 2 hours. So if you think APUSH lectures are boring, imagine sitting in a cemetery in the middle of November listening to some guy speak for 2 hours that you don't even know. Boring, right? And then this one random dude, who's this guy right here, who is this? Lincoln. Lincoln writes a short little 2.5-minute speech, gets up there, and delivers one of the most famous documents in American history called the Gettysburg Address. Now, the reason why this document was so important, and on your paper, if you will star or highlight the second bullet, and then highlight the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued only a few months before the Gettysburg Address. People kind of thought, yeah, it's a big deal, but is this really what Lincoln wants? What the Gettysburg Address does is it confirms this is now a war about slavery. And if you want to maybe write that down to confirm that, this is now a war about slavery. It's not just states' rights or anything along those lines. It is now also important in terms of slavery. And so what happens is that with the issuance of this address, now it gives massive emotional power to the North, saying that not only are we going to preserve the Union, but we are also going to stop slavery in the South. Give me 1 second. Now, one fun fact, by the way, about Gettysburg. So they have buried all the dead and things like that in the cemetery and things like that. Anybody have any guesses of the year the last body was recovered at Gettysburg?
2018.
Last year.
Not 2018.
2017.
Down a little bit.
2016.
Most people say 1950, so thanks for ruining it. Okay, keep going. 2002. That's right. 2002 was the very last year that somebody was found at Gettysburg. They found a Confederate soldier that probably died on the very first day. They found him. A guy was walking his dog, and his dog just went and dug up bones and came over and was like, "Hey, here's these bones." And it turned out to be a Confederate soldier. So if you ever go walk your dog and that happens, maybe you'll find a Confederate soldier. Probably got to be on the East Coast to do that, though. Theodora. All right, so following this the issuance of this. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through a couple of the major strategies of the war, major battles and things like that we need to cover really quickly, and then we'll talk about our current events. Sound good? Yes. Okay. So, first off, we're going to go over the two minorities at this time, which are black soldiers as well as women in the war. So if you will bracket black soldiers in the Civil War and women in the Civil War, and if you will write down minority, these are going to be your minority figures during this war. Now, in terms of the black soldiers, if you will put next to this former slaves, that's where the vast majority of this population is going to come from. Now, 1/5 of the adult male black population is going to fight in this war. The vast majority are runaway slaves who come to the North in order to be able to help the Union win the war. Now, a lot of them were not put on frontline positions. Many of them were put into backline position, 3rd, 4th string. A lot of them were cooks and different things like that. Now, in terms of the impact of this, it was another psychological warfare. When you have somebody from the Confederacy coming to fight you and they see that their former slaves are fighting against them, it makes them angry. One of the examples of this anger comes out in what's called the Fort Pillow Massacre. Basically, this Union army gets completely throttled. They surrender, they put their hands up, they put their guns down, they walk as prisoners of war. However, the Confederates see that they have African Americans in their troops. They decide to open fire and kill them all, even though all of them were unarmed. Kind of shows the psychological warfare of these two. On the other side, you have women in the war. If you will highlight medicine and nursing, that is the big thing that women are going to do in the war. Now, what they're going to do is we have so much blood and destruction from this war. And what's going to happen is that because of this, you just have this massive amount of death. For example, in these things called sunken roads, where it basically became mass pits of graves for all of these dead soldiers. At the Battle of Shiloh, for example, they have a bunch of ponds around it, and if you go today, those ponds appear to give like a red tone. They say it's because all the blood went into the soil, and because of that, it stained the soil red, which is why it comes off as a red hue. Women are able to go into these battles and be able to solve these problems and attempt to be able to help them. Marie Curie, if you've ever heard of her, she actually starts as a Civil War nurse, attempting to be able to help the men. Now, unfortunately, our sanitary conditions are not very healthy during this time. If you didn't know, 1/3 of all Civil War deaths were due to like shooting and being hit by artillery fire. 2/3 were from disease. So you might have survived the battle, but because you got amputated with some saw that 9 other people were amputated with, you died because of disease. So let's go over the last couple of turning points of the war. Most of these you have heard of before. If you will kind of star this area, you need to know all of these major turning points. These are the major battles and things like that you need to know. Now, with these major turning points, there's only 2 major ones that we haven't really talked about. Battle of Antietam. Why is Antietam famous? The bloodiest day in American history. About 51,000 people are going to die in a single day. Now, in terms of the massive amount of this is right at the beginning of the war, huge Union losses. A lot of people felt like the Union was going to lose because of this. They were massively unprepared. A lot of Union people said, just let the Confederacy go because we're clearly going to lose. Luckily, as time goes on, we have more bigger and better battles where we're able to become successful. And due to time, we're not going to watch the guy's head explode. I'm sorry. I know. You can go watch Glory with your parents' permission because it's rated R, and you can go watch the guy's head explode. So if you want to go do that on your own time. Now, the other person that we're going to talk about really quick is a guy named William T. Sherman. And you've probably heard of Sherman because he was one of your things that were on there, with Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman looks pretty bad apple in this picture. If you were to remember him, I would think of him as the super mean guy who looks like he hates everything because he was pretty vicious. Basically, what his goal was, he's going to do this thing called the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's March to the Sea. He is going to, for 1 month, march his troops from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah, Georgia, And basically, he burns the entire place down to the ground. This is one statement that he said, war is cruelty, there is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. Basically, make it as terrible as it can be so it gets done faster. So he goes throughout Savannah and he burns the whole place to the ground. Basically, he had everybody take torches and he just burned everything. When we look at the impact of that, here is one city in that aftermath. And a lot of these were women, kids, people who had homes that they were trying to keep while their husbands were at war, and everything gets burned to the ground. One of the biggest things that gets burned, though, is cotton. Why would cotton be important to burn?
It's a symbol.
It's a symbol, is one, so psychological warfare. What's the other thing?
They're
What's their industry? Cotton. And if you destroy cotton, what do you destroy? Their entire economy, right? Next to Sherman's March to the Sea on your paper, if you will make sure to highlight destroyed the Southern economy or however I wrote it on yours, you need to know that they destroyed the infrastructure of the South. It gets massively destroyed because of the destruction of this property. Now, the other thing they're going to destroy is railroads. As you know from this picture, think about like the American system with Henry Clay, where are the majority of the railroads at? The North. Which means that if you destroy one railroad in the South, what happens? The whole thing crumbles. So what he would do is he would do these things called Sherman neckties, or also called Sherman's pretzels. Basically, he would heat up the railroad lines, and he would twist them in order to destroy them. This is a picture of what that looks like. He destroys the entire railroad system of Georgia, and why that's important? Can you transport food if you have no railroad? Nope. What about necessities of weapons of war? Nope. So do you see how they're completely destroying everything? Yeah, you can't transport slaves. You can't do anything without railroads. That's like destroying the entire car system in America right now. So because of that, it destroys the South, and it's really kind of the final dagger of the South. Following this, then we're going to have the signing of the Treaty of Appomattox. So General Lee is going to sign it. A lot of people saw Lee as a traitor because of this, because he signed it. But he did end the war in 1965, only a few weeks right before he is going to die.
Which one is Lee? Left.
This is Lee. If you go to the American Smithsonian, you can actually go and see this table. They have this table on display.
On the Emancipation Proclamation, it
Yes.
freed slaves only in southern states, so
Yes.
were the border states still allowed to have slaves?
Yes. And why do you think the border states would be allowed to have slaves?
So they won't say.
So they wouldn't secede. It was another war tactic.
So then at the treaty, they were like all slaves. So that was
Well, officially, servitude gets made illegal through a constitutional amendment after the war ends.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that in Reconstruction next class. All right. So you can put this paper away and grab out your homework paper.